On the afternoon of April 19, 1775, about a mile west of Lexington, Massachusetts, the best soldiers in the British Army started to run. They were not retreating.
Keep up, keep up.
They were not withdrawing in good order.
They're right behind us.
They were flat out running.
Keep running, don't look back. To the rear.
Ensign Henry de Bernier of the 10th Regiment of Foot was right there in the column. He wrote that when their ammunition began to fail and the light infantry companies were too exhausted to keep flanking the road, a great number of wounded men could barely get forward, and a great confusion set in. Colonel Francis Smith, their commanding officer, had taken a musket ball through the leg. Officers all along the column were hit.
March! We must not delay!
De Bernier wrote that they attempted to stop the men and form them too deep, but it was no use. The confusion only got worse. And then, he wrote, the officers got to the front and presented their bayonets and told their own soldiers that if they advanced any further, they would die. British officers pointing weapons at British soldiers, threatening to kill their own men just to keep them from running headlong into the next ambush. These were not some ragged garrison unit pulling guard duty at a backwater fort. They were grenadiers and light infantry, the elite companies hand-picked from 11 different regiments in the Boston garrison. The grenadiers were the tallest, strongest men in each regiment, chosen specifically for their size and aggression. The light infantry were fast, resourceful skirmishers trained to fight in exactly the kind of broken terrain they were now dying in. A Scottish physician named Dr. Robert Honeyman had spent that winter in Boston watching the light infantry drill on the common. He wrote that they were young, active fellows trained in regular discipline and also in a peculiar method of irregular and bush fighting. He watched them run out on the wings of the regiment, lie on their backs to reload their muskets, then roll over and fire from their bellies. They carried powder horns instead of standard cartridge boxes, so they could reload faster in rough ground. These men were supposed to be the answer to colonial guerrilla tactics.
Watch your step, they're closing in.
They were supposed to be the best Britain had in North America. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they were a panicked mob on a dirt road, being shot to pieces by farmers who knew every stone wall and apple orchard for miles around. So, how did this happen?
To the left, take cover.
How did 700 of Britain's finest end up running for their lives along a country lane? The answer starts the night before with a secret mission that was not secret at all. General Thomas Gage was the Royal Governor of Massachusetts and commander of all British forces in North America. By the spring of 1775, he was caught between two impossible positions. King George III and Prime Minister Lord North were sending him direct orders to crack down on the colonists after the Boston Tea Party. They wanted results. They wanted obedience. They were also sending 3 additional generals, William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne, to reinforce Boston, which told Gage that London thought he was not getting the job done. Meanwhile, the colonists themselves were openly stockpiling weapons for a fight they increasingly believed was inevitable. Muskets, cannon, gunpowder and ammunition were being gathered and hidden in the town of Concord, about 18 miles northwest of Boston. Gage had spies inside the colonial resistance. One of them, a doctor named Benjamin Church, told him exactly where the supplies were stored. Gage decided to send a strike force to seize and destroy everything before the colonists could use it. The plan called for speed and secrecy above all else. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith of the 10th Regiment of Foot would lead about 700 soldiers out of Boston under cover of darkness. They would cross the Charles River by boat, march through the night, reach Concord by dawn, destroy the weapons, and return before the countryside even knew they were gone. The orders from Gage were specific. Smith was to seize and destroy all artillery, ammunition, provisions, tents, small arms, and all military stores, whatever. What those orders did not mention was that Concord was 18 miles from Boston. That meant a round trip of nearly 40 miles through countryside, where the people were in open rebellion and could summon thousands of armed men on very short notice. Everything went wrong from the moment the boats hit the water. The troops were ferried across the Charles River and landed in a flooded marsh near Cambridge. They stood in cold water up to their knees, waiting for supply boats that took hours to arrive. By the time the column finally started marching, it was well past midnight. Every man was cold, wet, and tired before they had walked a single mile, and the mission was already blown. The colonists knew the British were coming. Riders were thundering through the countryside, spreading the alarm from town to town. The most famous of those riders was Paul Revere, a silversmith from Boston. Revere crossed the Charles River by rowboat and rowed north through Charlestown and Medford into Lexington. He reached the home where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were staying around midnight and warned them to flee. Hancock was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies and a major financier of the rebellion. Adams had helped organize the Boston Tea Party. Both men were targets. William Dawes took a different route out of Boston, riding south through Roxbury and then west. A third rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, was the only one who actually made it all the way to Concord. Revere was captured by a British patrol near Lincoln, but the damage was already done. Signal guns were firing across the countryside. Church bells were ringing. Across dozens of towns, men were pulling muskets off their walls and heading for the road. Smith's column reached Lexington at about 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun was just coming up over the village green. Waiting there in two loose ranks were about 70 militia under the command of Captain John Parker, a 46-year-old farmer and veteran of the French and Indian War. Parker knew he was outnumbered almost 10 to 1. He told his men to stand their ground, but not to fire unless fired upon.
Hold the line, boys!
The British vanguard came around a bend in the road and saw the militia blocking their path. Major John Pitcairn rode forward and shouted at the colonists to lay down their arms and disperse. What happened next is still debated 250 years later. Parker, seeing the full size of the force coming at him, ordered his men to break ranks and leave. They started to move, but then a shot rang out. Nobody knows who fired it. The nervous British soldiers, interpreting that single shot as an attack, opened up with a ragged volley into the dispersing militia. When the smoke cleared, 8 of Parker's men lay dead on the Lexington village green. 10 more were wounded. One British soldier had been grazed.
Watch the left flank! Close the gap! Forward!
The column reformed and continued west toward Concord, leaving the dead and wounded colonists behind them. The British reached Concord around 8 o'clock in the morning.
Keep moving, don't stop!
Smith split his force. He sent about 220 troops under Captain Lawrence Parsons to secure the North Bridge over the Concord River, and then continue to the Barrett Farm, where the main weapon cache was supposedly hidden. But the colonists had been tipped off days in advance. Most of the weapons had already been moved or buried in freshly ploughed fields. The British search parties found some gun carriages and wooden supply crates, which they burned in the town centre. That fire changed the entire day. From a ridge above town, the growing force of colonial militia, now close to 400 men from several surrounding towns, saw smoke rising from Concord. They thought the British were burning their homes.
They're everywhere! Watch your spacing!
Colonel James Barrett gave the order to march toward the bridge. On the far side, 3 British light infantry companies under Captain Walter Lorry watched the colonists coming down the hill. Lorry was outnumbered and he knew it.
Fire unless fired upon! Hold the bridge!
He pulled his men back across the bridge and formed up on the east bank. The Americans kept coming. The British fired warning shots, then a full volley. 2 Americans were killed. The order came from Major John Buttrick, who was standing right at the bridge. "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" The militia fired into the British ranks. 3 Redcoats were killed.
Watch the left flank! Keep moving up the road!
4 of the 8 officers were hit.
Watch the woods! They're coming!
The remaining British and ran back toward Concord Centre.
Watch your spacing, lads.
It was the first time in the conflict that colonists had deliberately and intentionally fired on the King's troops. The war had truly started. By late morning, Smith knew the mission was over. He had found almost nothing of value.
They're in the trees. Watch the left flank. Hold the bridge!
He had dead and wounded men, and every hour more colonial militia were arriving from surrounding towns. Companies from Reading, Billerica, Chelmsford, Sudbury, Framingham, and Bedford were already on the march. The countryside for 20 miles in every direction was turning out armed men. Smith had no choice. He gave the order to retreat to Boston.
Keep moving, lads, straight ahead.
Around
moving,
noon,
lads.
the
Faster.
British column started east on the Bay Road out of Concord.
Don't fall behind. They're coming.
Smith was a professional soldier and he organized his force properly. He put a strong vanguard at the front, a rear guard behind, and flanking parties of light infantry sweeping the fields on both sides of the road. This was textbook military doctrine, the kind of formation described in Colonel Humphrey Bland's treatise on military discipline, a book that practically every officer in the British Army owned. The flankers were supposed to find ambushes behind walls and in woodlots and drive them off before they could fire on the main body. The first mile went quietly.
Colonel, we're taking heavy fire. Reform the line, lads, quickly now.
Then, the column reached a crossroads called Meriam's Corner, still within the bounds of Concord. A narrow bridge forced the flanking parties to pull in close to the road.
Watch the tree line, steady on men.
Militia companies from Reading, Chelmsford and Billerica were waiting behind the farmhouses and stone walls. Reverend Edmund Foster, a militiaman from Reading, described an eerie silence as the British came down the hill. He said the Redcoats marched with slow but steady steps, without music, without a word being spoken that could be heard. Then the light infantry stepped onto the narrow bridge.
Hurry up, they're right behind us.
Ensign Jeremy Lister of the 10th Regiment wrote that the moment they descended the hill into the road, the rebels began a brisk fire from all quarters, from behind hedges and walls. The 18-mile battle for the road had begun, and it would not stop until dark. What made this fight so devastating for the British was the terrain itself. Lieutenant John Barker of the 4th Regiment later described the country as amazingly strong, full of hills, woods, and stone walls, and he wrote that the rebels did not fail to take advantage of every one of them. The landscape was open pasture and meadow, crisscrossed with stone walls and rail fences, dotted with woodlots and apple orchards. Every wall was cover. Every hill was a firing position. And the colonists knew every foot of this ground because it was literally their land. They had farmed it, walked it, hunted on it their entire lives. The British flankers fought hard in return.
Blast this heat. I must have water.
Marine Captain William Souter wrote that sometimes they took possession of one hill, sometimes of another. They were not just walking alongside the column, they were actively fighting to control the high ground, clearing hillsides and orchards, trying to keep the column safe. A tactical study done at the site in 2015 confirmed that the broken landscape made it impossible to keep flanking parties out constantly. The moment the flankers pulled back to cross a stream or climb a fence, militia would rush forward from behind the nearest wall and fire into the packed column at close range. At a spot called the Bloody Angle, about 2 miles east of Concord, the road bent sharply between two ridge lines. Colonial militia positioned themselves on both sides. Major Lomi Baldwin ordered his men to scatter and make use of the trees and walls. According to Edmund Foster, the British were hemmed between two fires. The Redcoats took heavy casualties in a short but vicious crossfire before they could push through. But the worst stretch of the retreat before Percy arrived was the approach to Lexington. Captain John Parker was waiting there. The same Parker whose men had been shot down on the green that morning. He had gathered his surviving militia on a rocky hillside overlooking the road. These men had spent the entire morning thinking about what had happened to them at dawn. When the British column came within range, Parker's men opened fire from the high ground at close range. The British could not stop to fight back effectively.
They're gaining on us, sir. To the bridge, faster.
They could only keep moving through the kill zone, taking casualties with every step. This is where the column truly started to fall apart. The light infantry had been flanking for hours. They had been running up and down hills, crashing through orchards, and fighting at every stone wall between Concord and Lexington. They were physically finished. Ammunition was dangerously low. Smith was wounded and barely able to stay in his saddle. Panic was spreading through the ranks. The men stopped retreating in formation and simply ran. And then, on a hill just east of Lexington Common near Monroe's Tavern, they found rescue. Brigadier General Hugh Percy had arrived from Boston with about 1,000 reinforcements from the 1st Brigade and 2 6-pounder field guns. Percy's men formed a line of battle on the ridge, and the artillery fired into the surrounding woods, scattering the pursuing militia with a sound most of those colonists had never heard before on a battlefield. Smith's shattered troops staggered behind Percy's line and collapsed in the grass. Percy had saved them, but it almost did not happen at all. Gage had ordered the reinforcements forward at 4 o'clock in the morning. Through a chain of staff blunders, Percy's brigade did not actually march out of Boston until after 9 o'clock. 5 hours lost to paperwork and miscommunication. Percy had also made a hard choice. He left his supply wagons behind with a small guard to move the column faster, which meant the combined force now had limited ammunition and no extra provisions. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon when Percy reached Lexington. He later wrote to his father that he had the happiness of saving Smith's force from inevitable destruction. Percy gave the men about half an hour of rest while the cannon kept the militia at bay. Wounds were treated, ranks were reformed. Percy studied the situation and made his decisions quickly.
Maintain formation.
He was an aristocrat with close ties to King George III, a member of Parliament and the son of the Earl of Northumberland. He was also a competent field officer, and he could see that the men from the morning expedition were in no shape to do anything but follow orders and put one foot in front of the other. He placed the Grenadiers and light infantry from Smith's original column at the head of the new formation, which was the safer position. Percy's own 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers drew the dangerous rearguard assignment. Lieutenant Frederick Mackenzie of that regiment described how they lined walls and cover to their front with marksmen, then retired by files to high ground, forming a disciplined rear guard screen that kept the militia from overrunning them. Around 3:45, the entire force, now about 1,700 strong, began moving east again. The militia had pulled back temporarily when they saw Percy's cannons, but they regrouped fast. General William Heath and Dr. Joseph Warren, the chairman of the Committee of Safety, arrived to coordinate the colonial forces. Within minutes, the firing resumed, and as the column moved into more densely settled areas, the fighting got far worse. The village of Menotomy, which is called Arlington today, became the deadliest ground of April 19th.
We have to go now.
The houses, barns and taverns lining both sides of the road gave the militia perfect concealment at point-blank range. They fired from windows, from behind door frames, from stone walls barely 10 yards from the marching column. Lieutenant Mackenzie wrote that they were fired upon from all quarters, but particularly from the houses on the roadside. He added that the soldiers became so enraged at suffering from an unseen enemy that they forced open many of the houses from which the fire came and put to death all those found inside. The worst of it happened at the home of a 58-year-old farmer named Jason Russell. Russell had sent his wife Elizabeth, his 2 children, and a servant girl to a neighbor's farm for safety. Then he came back alone to defend his property. Militia from Danvers, under 26-year-old Lieutenant Gideon Foster, had marched 16 miles in 4 hours to reach Menotomy. Foster's men took cover behind a stone wall near Russell's house, alongside militia from Lynn, Needham, and Dedham. A neighbor named Amy Cutter tried to convince Russell to leave. Russell reportedly told him that an Englishman's home is his castle, and he stayed. When the British flanking parties swept through, they caught Foster's company trapped between the stone wall and the road full of redcoats. The militia ran for Russell's house.
Watch the roof, she's coming down.
Russell was hit by 2 musket balls and killed in his own doorway.
Stead your ground.
British soldiers stormed inside with bayonets. The fighting was hand-to-hand and room-to-room. Men who made it to the cellar survived only because they positioned themselves at the bottom of the stairs and shot the first soldier who tried to descend. Nobody else followed him down. By the end of the fight, 12 Americans lay dead in or around the house.
Push them back, hold the line.
Musket ball holes are still visible in the stairwell today. Close to 6,000 men fought in and around Menotomy that afternoon. 25 colonists and 40 British soldiers died in the village, making it the bloodiest single engagement of the day. The combined casualties at Menotomy exceeded the casualties at both Lexington and Concord put together. A historian named A. Michael Ruddiman later wrote that Lexington Green was an accident. Concord Bridge was a skirmish, but the most brutal and deadly warfare of the day happened along the length and breadth of Menotomy. Percy pushed through the village and crossed the Menotomy River into Cambridge. And here he made a decision that probably saved his entire force. The road ahead split in 2 directions.
Move! Clear the path!
The right fork led southeast through Cambridge toward Roxbury, crossing the Charles River by a bridge.
Hurry, men! Hurry!
Colonial militia had already torn up that bridge and were waiting in ambush on the far bank. Percy knew about the threat. He took the left fork instead, heading northeast toward Charlestown. The unexpected turn threw off the colonial pursuit and bought the column precious time. one final threat remained. A large force of militia from Salem and Marblehead, led by Colonel Timothy Pickering, had marched south and arrived at Winter Hill just as the British column was approaching Charlestown Neck. If Pickering's force had attacked, the British would have been caught between his men and the thousands of militia still pressing from the west and south. For reasons that have never been fully explained, Pickering did not engage. He claimed afterward that General Heath sent orders telling him to stand down and let the British pass.
Keep moving.
Heath denied ever giving that order. Whatever happened at Winter Hill, the British column slipped past without a fight. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the battered and bloodied Redcoats finally staggered into Charlestown and formed a defensive position on Bunker Hill. The guns of the Royal Navy warships anchored in the harbour covered them. The colonial militia wisely broke off the pursuit, and the longest day any of those soldiers had ever lived through came to an end. The final count was staggering. Out of about 1,700 British troops engaged that day, 73 were killed, 174 were wounded, and 26 were missing. That is, 273 casualties, roughly one soldier out of every 6. Many of those men had been awake for 2 straight days and had marched close to 40 miles in 21 hours, more than half of it under constant fire. Eventually outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The colonists lost 49 killed and 95 total casualties across the day. From a purely mathematical standpoint, roughly 3,500 militia firing on the column for 18 miles had only hit about 250 Redcoats. The marksmanship was never the point, but accuracy was never the next.
Lads, move it! Fall back, they're flanking us! To the rear, quickly now!
News of the fighting spread across the colonies faster than anyone expected. Within days, riders carried word to Connecticut, New York, and beyond.
They are flanking us!
Within weeks, more than 20,000 militia from all across New England marched to the outskirts of Boston and ringed the city. They came from Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. They camped in fields, slept in barns, and dug earthworks facing the British lines. The army that was not supposed to exist now surrounded the army that was supposed to be in charge. The British garrison that had marched out to disarm the colonists was trapped behind its own fortifications, besieged in the city it had occupied. The following month, the Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, and the conversation was no longer about petitions and compromise. It was about war.
Watch the left flank, they're upon us!
Park Ranger Jim Hollister at Minuteman National Historical Park put it clearly when he said the idea that the crisis could be settled peacefully, the idea that these soldiers were going to be able to return to their normal lives, all of that was gone. The world that they knew was over. Percy himself, the man who had rescued the column, changed his mind about the colonists that day. Before the battle, he had dismissed the Americans as cowards who would scatter at the first sign of a real fight. Afterward, he wrote to the Duke of Northumberland, his father, and told him that whoever looks upon the rebels as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. He said they had men among them who knew very well what they were about.
They are right behind us.
One afternoon on that road between Concord and Charlestown, was enough to turn a man who had spent his career in the greatest army on earth into a believer. The retreat from Concord was not the largest engagement of the American Revolution. It was not the most tactically sophisticated, and it was not the last word in the conflict between the colonies and the Crown. But it did something no other event in 1775 could have done. It showed ordinary people, men with farms and shops and families, that they could stand in a field against professional soldiers and survive the day. 2 months later, those same New England militia would fight the British again on the hills above Charlestown at the Battle of Bunker Hill. A year after that, the colonies would sign a Declaration of Independence, and 8 years after that, the last British soldiers would sail out of New York Harbor, leaving behind a new nation that traced its birth back to a single day on an 18-mile stretch of Massachusetts road. If this story grabbed you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us which moment on Battle Road you think changed the war. And if you want more stories like this, smash that like button so we know to keep them coming.